This is the lecture for chapters 11, 12, and 13. Chapter 11, Language and Style. We communicate through language constantly. We hardly ever think about it. We just do it. But it's a complicated process using this shared system of symbols, whether it's written, spoken, or signed, that a group of people uses to create meaning. And depending on the group, there's a different language with different rules and norms for vocabulary, grammar, and usage. And even within a group, the same word or symbol might have any number of different meanings. The denotative meaning of a word is basically its dictionary definition, what it explicitly names or describes. So if I look up the word cat in the dictionary, it says Felis catus, domesticated member of the family Felidae, and goes on to describe its characteristics. That's the denotative meaning of the word cat. However, there are many more connotative meanings of that word. That's the emotional associations the word cat suggests. So for some people, a cat conjures up warm, soft, fuzzy, positive feelings, while for others, annoyance or maybe even dislike or disgust. And if they're allergic to cats, they're looking for the nearest exit. Also, this chart shows that words with the same denotative meaning, youth, teen, adolescent, juvenile, they can have a whole range of connotative meanings. So depending on which word you use to describe a teenager, you can paint them with certain characteristics which they may or may not deserve. We're going to focus on the English language here because it's the one we're using in this class. That being said, you might be surprised to learn that there are many varieties of English spoken in the U.S., and many more spoken around the world, each with its own distinct rules and norms. We tend to think of English as white, mainstream English, but there's Black English, Cajun English, Mexican, Cuban, Puerto Rican, Pennsylvania Dutch, and a huge spectrum of regional dialects like Southern, Western, New England, etc. To put it bluntly, there's no right way to speak English, and all these different speech communities are groups that share common attitudes, values, and behaviors around language use. And this can include vocabulary, spelling, grammar, vocal inflection, and pronunciation. Addressing audience members who belong to speech communities different from your own can be kind of complex. It's easy if you belong to the same speech community, but when you don't, that's when it becomes more complex. There is still definitely pressure to conform to white mainstream English as the quote-unquote best way to speak, even though that's not the case. So this pressure to conform either to that kind of English or to the one that's most commonly spoken in your community, like if you move across the country and they all speak a different dialect and you feel pressured to speak like them, that's called assimilation. My mother was from England, and she moved here as a young bride. I never heard her real British accent because she worked very hard to get rid of it. She was really shy, and when she would talk, people would comment on her accent and ask her to talk more so they could hear it. And she would be so embarrassed that she just got rid of it and assimilated into an American accent. And that makes me really sad because her British accent was a part of her identity. Something that people who find themselves having to kind of live within two separate worlds, maybe their job puts them in contact with a more privileged speech community, while their social and home life exists within a marginalized or less privileged speech community, they will engage in what's called code switching, or moving back and forth between two different forms of English, like between Black English and mainstream English. Now, while it can be necessary for some people to do, it does place that burden largely on marginalized speakers. But in this class, I really try to foster an environment where the way someone speaks is part of their individual style, which we'll discuss momentarily. Style refers to a speaker's use of language to produce a particular effect or sensation. Style focuses not so much on what language a speaker uses, but rather on how the speaker is using it, the way the speaker selects and arranges symbols or words to create meaning. Sometimes a speech calls for vivid imagery and cleverness. Sometimes the speech calls for straightforwardness and plain talk. It depends on the topic, the context, and the audience. When we think about style in speech, we often think about great oratory, or what is known as the grand style of speaking. Grand style is language rich with vivid imagery, metaphor, and other figures of speech. Grand style is most effective at moments of great importance or great change, most commonly seen in political, religious, or ceremonial speaking. Two speech-making events that spring to my mind are, of course, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech and Kamala Harris's acceptance speech at the 2024 Democratic National Convention. If you haven't seen that, you should take a few minutes and watch it. That speech meets all the requirements of a speech in the grand style. That kind of speech, however, has to fit the context. If you were to try to give a speech like that anywhere else for any reason other than those that I mentioned, it probably isn't going to work, and you might even look a little silly. It's not the kind of thing that we would do in our class. Now, this isn't to say you can't incorporate some figures of speech into your own speech. In fact, these linguistic patterns might be very effective depending on the situation. Now, I'm not going to read all of these. They're in your book. There are things like figures of sensation, onomatopoeia. You've probably heard of those. Figures of repetition like alliteration and rhyme. There are also figures of transformation like metaphor, simile, and personification. Figures of reversal like antithesis, and figures of absurdity like irony and hyperbole, which, like I said, you should look those over and see if any of those things might fit into your speech. Now, the opposite of the grand style of speaking is the plain style, and it's just what it sounds like: simple, clear, and direct. It's generally used for technical, professional, and legal presentations. It consists of basic words, short sentences with simple grammatical structure, and clear organizational patterns. So you'd be choosing the most precise words to get your point across, eliminating unnecessary words, using terms the audience is familiar with, and don't use jargon unless you know that the audience understands what you mean. Don't use ambiguous words that might mean more than one thing unless you make it clear what you are referring to. Now, while plain style can be very good for certain kinds of presentations, it can run the risk of being boring, impersonal, and even patronizing to an audience. If they already know what you're talking about, they might feel like you're talking down to them. Now we come to the middle style. This style combines elements of both the grand style and the plain style. It has just enough heart, vividness, and maybe a little emotion to catch the audience's interest, combined with good, solid explanation of your ideas and concepts. Think about your upcoming speech. How much of it needs to be connecting to the audience in an interesting way, and how much of it needs to be informing in an educational way, and that's the balance that you're looking for. So you need to start developing your own personal style as a public speaker. It's going to be a combination of your own linguistic style with your balance of grand and plain speaking styles. So these exercises, the speech amplification exercise, the speech editing exercise, and the signature style exercise will be available on the Canvas page under the video. Let's move on to Chapter 12, Vocal and Physical Delivery. When you watch someone do a really great job delivering a speech, it just seems so effortless and natural, like they didn't even have to try. But frankly, they probably did have to try and spent a lot of time working on that speech. So that's the key to good delivery. By learning the tools of vocal and physical delivery any speaker can develop their own natural speaking style and make their presentation shine. Delivery is the way you communicate the content of your presentation. Vocal delivery has to do with volume, pitch, and rhythm. Non-vocal or body delivery has to do with gestures, posture, and facial expressions. Effective delivery helps you do 4 things: convey information, create interest, communicate credibility, and evoke emotion. So how does it convey emotion? By providing clarity, which is the audience's experience of understanding something without effort. Clear delivery can help you emphasize important points and reinforce your message. Now, clarity is always important, but it's particularly important if you're presenting unfamiliar or complex information to your audience. How do you create interest? By adding variety to your delivery, you can keep your audience engaged. Variety is the experience of change, range, or diversity. It is produced when speakers speed up or slow down, speak louder or softer, change their posture or gesture, or even shift the clarity, immediacy, and mood of their presentation. How do you communicate credibility? You do that by building trust with your audience using immediacy, which is the experience of physical and psychological closeness. So things like more smiling, eye contact, an open posture, and physical proximity depending on the context and culture. And effective delivery allows you to evoke the emotions of the audience during the speech by using vocal patterns, movement, and facial expressions to shift their mood over the course of the presentation. That's a lot of power. Let's see how we do that. Let's start with your voice. Vocal delivery is the way you use your voice to express yourself. The voice's volume, rate, pitch, rhythm, articulation, and pronunciation all influence the effectiveness of your delivery. Now, when I say voice, I also mean the non-linguistic modifiers like those used in sign language. For example, the size and sharpness of a sign can communicate volume. The aspects of vocal delivery are, first, volume, how loud or soft your voice is. Now, during the pandemic, people were in their homes and nobody was talking very loud. So when we came out of our houses, one of the first things I noticed as a speech teacher was everyone was really quiet. I had to tell everyone in my speech classes to speak up. It was really noticeable to me. What you think is loud enough might not be loud enough in a classroom. I'll let you know. The rate is how fast or slow you're talking. Mostly in my classes, people always start out talking too fast because they're nervous, and I totally get that. But you're going to lose your audience's attention if they can't follow your train of thought. I know you want to get it done and sit back down, but that's not why you're up there, so calm the heck down. Generally, around 150 words per minute is a good rate, about what I'm doing now. And here's the deal. If you're trying to make a point, you can slow down and say things very emphatically like this. See how slowing that down gives it emphasis? Anyway, you can play with rate. Pitch is another aspect of vocal delivery. That has to do with where your voice falls on the musical scale. Is it high or low? Research has shown that Americans find lower-pitched voices to be more competent than higher-pitched voices. However, higher-pitched voices are considered more friendly. So, depending on the message you're trying to send, you might need to vary your pitch or actually challenge those vocal stereotypes. Rhythm has to do with a repeated pattern of sounds. You can repeat rhythms, or you can punctuate with pauses or silence for variety. One of the things we tend to do when we're anxious, though, is use verbal fillers like and which is a common way to fill time when we're thinking of something to say. But in a speech, they are often used because we're anxious about silences. There's nothing wrong with silences. Instead of filling that silence with meaningless ums and ahs, punctuate your words with a meaningful silence. Articulation is the ability to make vocal sounds clearly and distinctly, and pronunciation is articulating a word in a particular way to conform to the expectations of an audience. While we generally expect correct articulation and pronunciation, everyone's speech has accents and variations, and most of us find some sounds easier to make than others. Also, disabilities, injuries, illnesses, and a variety of other causes can also affect articulation. Now, pronunciation is a bit different. If you're concerned with whether you're pronouncing a word correctly, you can always look it up on dictionary.com or the Cambridge Dictionary. They both have audio recordings of common pronunciations for many English words and a lot of famous people's names if you need to use them in a speech. Let's move on to physical delivery, which is what you do with your body while you're giving the speech. You don't just stand there with your arms hanging at your sides, even if that's what you'd like to do, and I'm pretty sure that's not what you'd like to do. Physical delivery refers to a speaker's non-linguistic gestures, expressions, movement, and self-presentation. Physical delivery can have dramatic impacts on the clarity, variety, immediacy, and mood of a presentation by reinforcing or even transforming the meaning of a speaker's words. Here's the thing, no matter what words come out of your mouth, what you do with your body has at least as much and maybe more impact with your audience. They are paying attention to your nonverbal communication, so you should make it count. Proximity refers to the perception of physical distance between a speaker and their audience. Our experience of immediacy is tied to our perceptions of physical space. Now, when I say this, I don't mean you should get all up close and personal with your audience. It obviously depends on the situation. A speaker's proximity to an audience can be divided into public, social, personal, and intimate zones. So public distance, this would be like a very large gathering, like a rally or a graduation, where it's not very personal and there's distance between you and the speaker. Social distance would be like being at a party or like being in a classroom like ours. Personal distance is hanging out with friends, and intimate distance is, very personal. Anyway, the feeling of immediacy is different at all these levels. Then there's posture, how you hold and position your body. How a speaker positions themselves can affect how you see them. Closed posture, like arms and legs crossed or held close to the body, can communicate discomfort or even dislike, while open posture, relaxed arms and feet shoulder-width apart, communicates more immediacy. Inclined posture, head down and shoulders slouched, that expresses sadness or boredom, while upright posture, chin up and shoulders back, communicates confidence and interest. You might not have even known that the way you hold yourself communicates anything, but it does. However, if your most comfortable speaking posture or position does not allow for standing up straight due to illness or injury, that's fine. There are other ways to create immediacy and positivity. Gesturing is a critical part of nonverbal communication. It's moving your body, usually your arms, hands, or head, to communicate meaning. Gesturing serves one of 6 functions. Substitution. This communicates your meaning all by itself. You know what flipping the bird or flipping someone off means, right? Yeah, that's substitution. You don't have to say a word. The other person knows exactly what you mean. Just don't do that in a speech. Reinforcement repeats the meaning of your words. So you point to yourself while you say me or my, or show the small size of something with your fingers when you say it was this tiny. Contradiction indicates the opposite of our words. That's usually done when you're kidding or being sarcastic. You say yes while shaking your head no, or wink while you talk about how awesome something was to mean that it really wasn't that awesome. Accentuation highlights words, phrases, or moments. These gestures don't have a specific meaning. They just draw attention to what you're saying. Maybe you pound your fist on the table while making a point, or you hold both your hands out and move them back and forth during the rhythm of the sentence. Regulation is something that helps us take turns in a conversation. Yes, it's often used in conversations or maybe during question and answer sessions. These gestures let someone know when it's their turn to talk or when they need to stop talking. And adaptation. These help us soothe or calm ourselves. They're usually unconscious gestures, habitual movements that we do when we're stressed, which often happens during speaking situations, like rocking back and forth, pushing our hair out of our face or touching our face, putting our hands in our pockets. You should really try to become aware of them and not let them be so continuous that people start to notice that instead of what we're saying. But most of us have these adaptive gestures, so don't feel too bad about them. Just try to be aware of them. Facial expressions. Yes, people are looking at your face during your speech. That may bother you, but it really shouldn't. They're not doing it to judge how cute you are. They're doing it to try to understand what you're telling them. It's part of the listening process. But if they see a fearful or worried expression on your face, it might make it hard for them to emotionally connect with you, which is part of what needs to happen. So relax that face. Make some weird, exaggerated expressions, well, not standing in front of us, of course, but maybe in the car before you come to class, and stretch those 42 muscles in your face out nice and loose. Then start your speech from that nice, relaxed baseline. You'll be more able to keep those facial expressions in line with the emotions you're trying to portray in your speech. Eye contact. While eye contact does mean looking people directly in the eyes, it does not mean staring at them. That's a completely different thing, and it's a pretty creepy sensation if it's ever been done to you. What it means is that during the course of your speech, you've looked each person in the eyes briefly a couple of times. Scanning the room, stopping briefly at individuals, especially those who look particularly interested, for a second or two before moving on to someone else. And of course, you can look down at your notes, look up at your visual aid, or wherever you need to look. Staring, however, is not cool. Now, if you're looking at a camera, which you will be during your motivated sequence speech, you should mostly be looking at the camera because that's a little bit different. It's more personal, and if you look away, it's more obvious. But in the classroom, you're doing your best to engage the class as a whole, and that means looking at all of us eventually. If you have major anxiety issues about looking people in the eye, the book recommends visually scanning people's foreheads. That might be better for you, or practicing in an empty classroom. And adornment, or what you're wearing and how you look. Yes, that's part of your delivery. So clothing, hairstyle, makeup, jewelry, tattoos, eyewear, etc. Some public speaking situations call for certain kinds of attire, more or less formal, or specific costumes or clothing or uniforms, depending on your topic or the occasion. Make sure that whatever your appearance, it's in keeping with what you're attempting to portray. The old joke about how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice applies to public speaking. While your delivery is personal and situational, and you want a natural, relaxed delivery style, that only comes from practicing your presentation. Practice will help reduce your anxiety and help the audience to see your unique identity as a speaker. And the more you do it, the more your signature speaking style will come out. There are 4 common speech delivery methods, and each is best suited for particular context, purposes, and audiences. Speaking from memory or memorized delivery is of course used by actors in stage plays, but can be used by public speakers who give the same speech multiple times in different places, like politicians or social advocate speakers who go from place to place, giving the same speech over and over, or comedians who do the same set in different theaters. Manuscript speaking, in which a speaker presents from a full sentence copy of their speech. Well, I'm sure you'd love to do that. It takes a great deal of rehearsal to make this kind of delivery sound natural. Trust me, I've listened to so many boring academic paper presentations where professors just read their papers to an incredibly unengaged audience. The people who do this well are like news readers who have to do this for a living, and politicians who live by their teleprompter. They practice because they know they need to gain the trust of their audience. Also, many politicians who give critical policy speeches will use teleprompters with manuscripts because the wording is critical and they cannot afford to be misunderstood. Of course, they've practiced, so they can utilize effective vocal delivery and body language. Extemporaneous speaking, which is the delivery method we strive for in this class, is where you prepare and practice, but don't memorize. You speak from an outline, which allows you more freedom and flexibility than manuscript or memorized speaking, but is not as off the cuff as the last type, impromptu speaking, which is giving a presentation without any advanced preparation. Now, you never know when you might be called upon to do something like this. It usually happens in a business meeting. Your boss might ask you to say something about some project you're working on, or you might need to introduce yourself at an employee orientation meeting. The more experience you have as a speaker, the less traumatic these kinds of speaking experiences are going to be. As for you, you're going to shoot for the extemporaneous speaking style. It's by far the best for what we do in this class, and frankly, for whatever you do out there in the real world. So you need to consider some things as you start to practice. Think about your clarity, and by that I mean, can you be heard and understood? A lot of students simply haven't had to speak loud enough to be heard across a room, so make sure you're speaking loud enough. Mark up your speaking notes. Give yourself notes to add emphasis to words or phrases or pauses or gestures or whatever you think is going to create interest and help the audience understand you. You want to create immediacy and figure out what the mood is that you want to set for the audience and your speech. And then, of course, practice, practice, practice. The best way is to divide it up into sections. Practice the introduction a couple of times, give yourself a break, practice the first main point, take a break, etc. Through the whole speech, spread it out. Do that a few times. Wait a day, then try to do it all at once. Then find some family members or friends, give the speech to them, ask for feedback. Most people will be helpful. You can even video yourself and use it to see where you can improve before you come to class and present it to us. When you practice a presentation, you're building your overall delivery skills and developing your own signature delivery style. So the vocal projection challenge, the speed check, the speed feedback activity, the vocal range exercise, and the recording rhythm exercise are all available under the video on the Canvas page. Let's move on to Chapter 13, Presentation Aids and Slides. While we've commonly referred to them over the years as visual aids, presentation aids include any physical, visual, and audio elements that a speaker adds to their presentation. So supplementing your speeches with presentation aids can educate, entertain, and influence your audience. Of course, in my class, these aids are a required part of your informative, persuasive, and motivated sequence speeches. I expect you to learn how to use them effectively. Well-designed presentation aids can make your speech more accessible for audience members with sensory processing challenges. For instance, take this image. Now, this is actually used to test for color blindness. If it just looks like a bunch of fuzzy balls and you can't see any numbers inside the balls, you might want to get your vision checked. But my point in putting this here is that unless you're checking for color blindness, putting something with such low contrast on the screen would make it difficult for any of us really to see anything. So clarity is important, not just in words, but also in images. So if it's something you want everybody to see, make sure it's crisp and clear and that we can actually see it. These core principles are important for any presentation aids that you use. Make sure, whatever you use, that it can be seen by everyone. The whole point of a presentation aid is that it's part of your message. If it can't be seen or heard, it can't do its job. They need to be easy to understand and interpret. Now, your explanation is certainly part of the presentation aid. You don't just throw it up there, never refer to it, and expect us to figure it out. You incorporate it into your delivery. But it shouldn't be so complicated and convoluted that it takes 10 minutes for you to interpret it for us. If it's slides, they should be consistent from one to the next and look good. And they should be interesting and engaging enough for us to look at. And most of all, whatever you're using, it should keep the focus on you. Sometimes people think, oh good, they'll be looking at the visual aid, so they won't be paying attention to me. But that's not what a visual aid is for. It's to help you explain your topic. It's not for you to hide behind. It's to enhance your message. It shouldn't be too difficult for you to figure out what kind of visual aid to use. They tend to spring naturally from your topic and the outline. You could certainly use some kind of text presenting information in numbered or bulleted lists, not paragraphs of information. Do not put your outline into your PowerPoint slides. You can certainly display information in tables, probably using the sans serif fonts, like the ones up here, Arial, Calibri, or Helvetica, as they tend to be more readable than some of those more fancy ornamental fonts. Images or photographs are great, especially for ideas, concepts, and objects that are difficult to explain verbally. Just make sure to find good, clear images that capture exactly what you want to display. Video and or audio clips are fine, but there are a couple of things you need to remember. First, they take up precious time, which you have to factor into your speech. So I recommend only using clips of 30 seconds or less. Also, if you're using YouTube or other online sources, you need to make sure you've got the clip ready to go before the speech, and that you've checked to make sure there isn't a pop-up ad on it, because that can put another 30 seconds onto the video, which none of us wants to look at. So be aware of that. Props are objects that you bring to class to show us. For instance, if you're doing a demonstration speech showing us how to make something, all the ingredients or the parts, make sure you bring everything you need. You probably can't show us the entire process, but you can bring it in steps and show it to us at specific steps, then the final completed piece. If you're going to do something like this, ask me how to do the presentation aids. Now, depending on your topic, diagrams or maps might be good presentation aids. Diagrams are visual representations of structures or processes, and this is a Venn diagram here. Maps generally depict the relative positions of different regions and features in an area. Or maybe charts or graphs might be just what you need to express your ideas. In this case, there is a pie chart, which is a circular graph divided into wedges that represent parts of the whole pie. Or bar graphs. Bar graphs use either horizontal or vertical bars to show differences in values or amounts. Or maybe line graphs or timelines would illustrate your point. Line graphs use one or more lines to track changes over time, allowing quick comparisons of two or more trends. And timelines are graphic representations of events in sequence. Now you need to decide how to present your presentation aid. You can certainly create a poster if you want and bring it to class. You do need to use good visual design techniques. I don't recommend using our whiteboard though. If your speech topic lends itself to it, maybe a handout, but don't pass something out to the audience that would cause them to ignore you and just read it. If you aren't sure if that would be a good presentation aid, you should ask me. We do have a document camera, which is a close-up camera that shows up on the overhead projector, so it can show both documents and objects to the audience, which, depending on what you're doing, might be a good idea. But of course, the most popular kind of presentation aid is PowerPoint or other kinds of slideshows. The majority of you have created PowerPoint slides by now. If you haven't, you can probably find someone to help you do it. The Centers for Academic Success has people who work with COM 101 students and can help you put together a PowerPoint slide if you've never done it before. You need to choose a presentation theme that seems to fit with your topic and the information you want to present. Add your content and plan your transitions and animations. Please note that weird animations like words spinning into and out of the slides tends to make your presentation look cheesy, so keep that in mind. Things to remember about slide presentations. Don't put your outline or your bibliography on your slides. Those things belong in your outline, not on your slides. And definitely don't just stand there and read off the slides. Now, can you glance at them, refer to them, maybe read a bit off them, and then rephrase or expand on what's there? Sure. But they're not there for you to read off of. Make sure they can easily be seen. Consider where you are in relation to them. You shouldn't block them, but you should be able to see them if you need to. You should definitely practice with them so you know when to move to the next slide. And hey, you need to figure out what to do if for some reason, God forbid, the internet fails. What will you do? A good idea is to have your slide presentation on a thumb drive in case you can't access our Canvas page or your email. The thing is, as I said before, you and your ideas are the most important thing about your speech. The presentation aid is there to help you, but you're the shining star. It isn't. I'll put the planning presentation aids exercise on this Canvas page. This is the end of the lecture for chapters 11, 12, and 13.